Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy, and this time our lesson is dedicated to the basic endgame principles. Despite every endgame is unique and has its own crucial features, there are some basic general things that every chess player should know and use over the board. So the first and foremost, the king in the endgame should be active. The point is that, well, in the middle game stage and in the opening, of course, it is very hard to bring the king to the active position. It is very dangerous thing because there are a lot of pieces around and the king simply can't be checkmated, right? In the endgame stage, the situation changes dramatically, so there are not so many pieces on the board, and it is highly unlikely that the king will be checkmated. This makes possible to bring the king to the active position and to influence the position with the help of the king. For example, in this given position that you can see on the board, it is actually impossible to achieve anything without the king, because pawns are simply blockading each other, so it's not possible to do anything with pawns. So only the king can change the situation. That's why both sides try to bring their kings to much more active positions than they are at the moment. In general, it means to centralize the king. So let's have a look on that. So white plays king to f2, black king b7, king e3, king c6, king d4, and king to d6. So we can see that both sides actually centralized the kings. So white's king occupies the central position, black's king unfortunately doesn't occupy exactly the central square, I mean d4, e4, e5, or d5, but it is also placed very close to the center. Why it is so important usually to bring the king exactly to the center? Because of the flexibility of such a position, because look at this d4 square. So from here, the king can get to both king side and queen side easily. So depending on what black will do, let's say, the king will change his plans, right? So it is a flexible position, you should remember. So from the center, usually it takes the same quantity of moves, so it takes the same time to get to both queen side and king side. That's why central position is usually the target. In such a situation, of course, it is not possible to achieve anything further with the king, because black's king also placed very good and controls the squares of a possible breakthrough, c5, d5, and e5. But white plays a3 in this position, just waiting a bit, and appears that black has to make a decision, and this decision will be very, very tough, because it doesn't really matter where the king goes, and black has only king moves here. Well, white just gets further with his king, getting to opponent's pawns. For example, if king goes to c6, then king goes e5, and now king gets to this g6 pawn, which is weakened, which is not protected, not supported by pawns from adjacent files, so it is the target. This pawn also protects f5 pawn. This means that if g6 pawn drops, then most likely f5 will be also captured. And after some moves, this happens. So white wins both pawns on the king side. And this is, of course, fatal because white starts promoting one of his pawns to a queen. It's very simple to do. And white already has an extra queen and easily winning position. That is, by the way, shows us another very important principle in endgame stage. So material matters. So in the opening stage or middle game stage, let's say losing the pawn might be not that bad. At least it is not a immediate catastrophe. So you can usually compensate the missing material with the activity of your other pieces. You can create a counterplay and so on. In the endgame stage, losing the pawn, even a single pawn, can be fatal, like here. So if g6 drops, this means, well, at very least, white will have this very annoying g5 pawn, which is a passed pawn and a potential queen, and also f5 will be also weakened, and well, in many cases it also drops automatically, so white will have already two extra pawns and so on. So this is a typical situation. losing material in the endgame stage might be fatal, so material matters. If the king goes to the other side, let's say after a3 black chooses e6 square, then king gets to the queen side, so active king decides here. What is really important here that white has very nice pawn structure, so when the king makes his move away from the center, like here to c5, so the pawn f4, for example, controls e5 square, which prevents opponent's king from activation, at least immediate activation, and this stops black from creating a dangerous counterplay. That is very important. So black has to spend the time on the passive move, which makes nothing but waiting, because black simply has to make a move. And after king b6, well, only here black has a chance to activate his own king, which is of course very late. So king takes a6, king d5, king b5. Again, after getting to the queenside pawns, white managed to win both of them because the one was vulnerable and simple prey, and another one was supported only by that pawn. So that was very simple to win the second one after winning the first one. And in this case, we can see that black has counterplay. So black also manages to activate the king to break through to attack white's pawns. But the problem is that white starts pushing his a pawn immediately, while black still has to spend the time on taking white's pawn. So king takes f4, a5, king takes g5, a6. And we can see that white needs to make only 1 and 2 moves to promote pawn a6 to a queen. So that's to achieve a decisive material advantage, and black has to make much more. So f4, f3, f2, f1, this means 4 moves. So white is definitely much faster in a promotion of the own pawn, which means that white easily wins here because queen can stop this f3 pawn without problems. Moreover, the king is not that far, so he can simply get back to the king side and to help the queen to win this f3 pawn. And this gives us another principle. So the importance of creating a passed pawn as soon as possible. Passed pawn is the most important pawn in the endgame stage because it is a potential queen. And if you have an advanced passed pawn, well, you create great threats. So in many cases, as you can see, the one who starts pushing the pawn towards the promotion square first wins. Like here, so white simply started first and easily won the game because of the queen already on the board, while black still has to make 2 moves, so black is simply not in time. White wins here. So we squeezed already 3 important principles here. So the first one is the general activity of the king, which usually means the centralization of the king. The second is the importance of the material. So material matters. Losing even a single pawn might be fatal. And the third, the importance of passed pawn. So every passed pawn is a potential queen. So creating a passed pawn and quick pushing this pawn towards the promotion square may simply help you to win the game. Let's have a look on the other example. In this position, white's turn to move, and we can see that black's king is more active than white's one. Again, both are centralized. Black's king occupies exactly the central position. White's king occupies the position very close to central squares e4, d4, d5, e5, and also ready to be activated if there is a chance, of course. But at the moment, black's king is better placed. It is more active, and this causes serious problems because we can notice that white has no pawn moves, which means white has no weighted moves, and this means the king should move, and it is a problem because black's king attacks e4 pawn, so white's king has to be around this pawn to save it on the board, which means that white has only 2 possibilities. The one is king f3, another one king d3 move. Both of them give black a chance to activate the king further. So let's have a look which one will be better for white. If king goes to f3, black has the access now to another central square, which is a great one. It is d4. Now we can see that the king controls e3 square, still attacks e4 pawn, and g5 pawn controls f4, which actually means that white again has to move the king somewhere, has no chances to save the pawn e4. So white loses material immediately. King goes to f2, let's say, king takes e4. And as we discussed in the previous example, losing material might be fatal. So in this concrete situation, it is definitely fatal for white, because after king a2, black plays f5, g takes f5, king takes f5, let's say king to f3 and h5. Black has extra pawn, black has no problems to create a passed pawn on the king side. So for this purpose, black will just play g4, next move. And the next plan is simple. So at some point, black will just give up this passed pawn, but the king will make another breakthrough now to the queen side. So while white's king will be somewhere here just trying to blockade this resultant passed pawn on the king side, black's king will just make his way to a3 pawn, and then b4 will be captured automatically. So the same pattern that we already discussed in the previous example. So the one pawn is a weakness, another one is supported by this pawn. So if the one drops, another one drops automatically. So as a result, there will be an endgame with two extra pawns for black. One of them will be queened. So that is the basic layout of how black can win such an endgame. By the way, very important one to memorize, but you will definitely see a lot of these examples later in the course dedicated to king and pawn endgames. So here it is important to understand that this passive defense with the king f3 gives white nothing. So let's have a look what is the difference if white plays king to d3. So another move, still saving the pawn on the board, but giving black a chance to get to f4. This also looks horrible for white because the king now achieves this g3 square, very important one, so it has the direct access to pawns on the king side, so h3 and g4, and looks like black is just very fast in grabbing those pawns. But here, white has the chance to come up with the active counterplay, and this makes a big difference. So after king f4, white plays king to d4. As you can see, pawn e4 is still on the board if compared to the line with the king f3, because here after king d4, pawn drops automatically. Here it is still on the board, and let's have a look what is going on. So king g3, king goes to d5, activating the king. So according to the most important principle of all endgames, so activity of the king, right? King goes to h3, and now king goes to e6, counter-attack, right? So f6 is also vulnerability, and well, white has a chance to grab it here. King takes g4 and king takes f6. So what happened? As a result, we can notice that black has extra material. That's true because white managed to capture only one pawn on f6, while black captured the pawn on h3 and one more on g4. So black has an extra pawn. But a great difference now, we can notice it immediately. So the king is very active, first of all, on f6. So if compared to the line with the king f3, we had the same actually material balance, right? So black was up a pawn, but the king was just passive and no counterplay was possible. So here position is different because now the counterplay is possible because white has a passed pawn. It is the e4, and the king simply supports its movement towards the promotion square. So black can't stop this pawn. So the best thing that black can do is to try to promote the on-passed pawn. But appears that white is just in time to come up with a sufficient counterplay. For example, if king goes to f4, just making possible for g5 pawn to be promoted, white plays e5, g4, e6, g3, e7, g2, e8, queen, g1, queen. So as we can see, both sides promoted simultaneously, and now white is a pawn down, but in this sort of endgame with queens on the board, there are usually a lot of checks possible, and after a series of two simple checks like queen b8 and queen b7, as we can see, white takes the pawn next move because it is check, so black can do nothing but going away with the king somewhere. So white just captures a6 pawn and position becomes materially balanced. So the same as after h5. So if black starts pushing his h pawn immediately without making the move with the king to f4, again, both sides promote simultaneously. And again, after a series of simple checks, white manages to grab this extra g5 pawn and position is equal. So white is by no means worse. So what can we squeeze out of this example? So again, this example showed us the importance of the active king, importance of passed pawns, but also this example gave us an understanding that sometimes the general activity of your pieces is much more important than the material balance, right? So we discovered that material matters, right? But in some cases, well, it's much better to be active and at the same time a material down than to be passive in a materially balanced position. So here we saw a very prominent example of this principle, right? So white sacrificed 2 pawns on the king side, h3 and g4 pawns, but made a breakthrough with the king to one of the pawns on the king side in opponent's camp, so that making his own pawn a passer, which gave white just a sufficient counterplay to make a draw. So passive defense had no chances to be sufficient in this situation, so passive defense led to losing the game easily. So this fourth important principle, which means that activity in many cases means more than material balance, concludes this lesson dedicated to basic principles. So knowing these basic endgame principles will help you definitely to master this stage of the game. I wish you all the best on this path. Thanks a lot for your attention and see you in next lessons.